Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Ask the Experts webinar. I'm Tracy Zatinik, Marketing Manager at Amplifi. I want to thank you for joining us for understanding data model and taxonomy in StiboSystems. As you know, when registering for this webinar, you had the option to pre-submit questions, which we will be answering today. During the presentation, you have the ability to submit questions through the Q&A feature. However, due to our limited time and the complexity of our questions, we will follow up at the end of the conclusion of this session. This session is being recorded. You can expect an email from us in the coming days with your link to the resource, or you can locate it on our website at goamplifi.com. Amplifi comes to the table as experts in the StiboSystems platform. Our team reflects 120 years of combined experience spanning over more than 200 projects, while working with over 100 clients within all industries and markets. Some of our team members contributing to our vast knowledge of the platform are our experts today. Robert Freimuth is a principal consultant with experience in business process design, technology, and solution deployment. He has successfully implemented solutions for many Fortune 500 organizations in automotive, manufacturing, retail, and the oil and gas industries. Jayesh, come on and say it for me, Jayesh.
Kondapuram.
Thank you. Jayesh is a senior solution architect at Amplifi. He has been designing, developing, and deploying MDM solutions across many domains like product, vendor, raw materials, customer, automotive for more than 10 years and has thoroughly enjoyed his journey in the ever-changing MDM landscape. Last but definitely not least, Chris Colyar is the Chief Technology Officer at Amplifi. He has been designing and implementing PIM MDM projects for 10 years across a variety of markets, industries, domains, and technologies. His focus is to understand business users' goals and guiding them through incremental successes to achieve them. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand this over to Chris to give us some information on StiboSystems.
All right, thanks, Tracy. So my MDM career actually began with Stevo, first as an architect, or first as a developer on the STEP platform, moving to architect, and then eventually into leadership. So I've spent a lot of time in my career in the ecosystem, made a lot of friends, colleagues, team members across different customers and projects. So really excited to share some of that experience and knowledge with you guys today. Just by way of introduction to the topic, wanted to really quickly at a high level explain what STEP offers from a data modeling perspective. So at its lowest level, it's a very graph-like database implementation. You have nodes, which are the things that your data is stored against. They have super types, which are system controlled elements that define the behavior within the software. And they have user types, which allows you to define how the different nodes and objects will interact with each other and put the rules against that. Then they have edges, and the edges are how we get to describe the relationships between those nodes, both between objects as well as between attributes and objects for assignment, maybe users and objects to ownership for permissions. So, and then the mapped values, which is the actual data that we have in the system. So if you put all that together, like STEP really gives you the ability to do anything. You are able to define a model to fit your business, no matter how unique you think your business is, the platform can support it. So modeling products for sale on e-commerce channels, obviously, that's an easy one. If you want to model every single vehicle ever sold in the US with every single option, validate which products fit in which places in those vehicles so that you have governance on what you're selling, it can do that. If you want to model scientific engineering data of proprietary components coming out of your R&D process, and you want to be able to map usage and features to a SKU based on a set of 6 attributes and build out some really rich data, you can do that. And if you want to marry contract relationships with your vendors and tie those to audited and licensed facilities to manufacture your product, to have an importable or an item that's ready for customs import so that you can run it through customs, which then translates into something that you're putting on a show floor or on your website, you can do that too. All of those are cases that we've run into with STEP, where we've gone beyond just mastering product data and we're doing something so much more, and the platform allows that. But the backbone to doing anything like that in a STEP solution is your data model. It's in the definition of the data in that model with a taxonomy. So that's the importance of this as kind of one of our first sessions, is just really diving into some details around that and getting your mind going on what some of those possibilities are. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jayesh to dig a little more deeper into some specifics.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so like Chris said, STEP is a multi-domain MDM platform. So you can model almost any real-world use case in STEP. It does not have to be products. It can be customers or locations, suppliers. So any real-world use case can be modeled in STEP. So the data model is the most foundational piece of a STEP implementation. And anything from workflows or the web UI or integrations is dependent on the data model that we come up with. So in STEP, an object type is the most the foundational piece, and basically any object in STEP has an object type. So an object can be something that exists in the physical world, like the product you're selling or the service you're offering, or a location of your warehouse, or it can be something just a logical, like a folder that you can use to group a bunch of objects. So an object type is the template that you use to define the characteristics of an object. And the actual objects are, the instances of the object type. So in STEP, there are 5 different super types, object super types, and assets are, used for storing information about, digital media like images and PDF documents and so on. Products are used to create hierarchies of objects, and they use the concept of inheritance to categorize data or objects of similar characteristics. Classifications or yellow folders are used to build alternate hierarchies or alternate versions of hierarchies of your products. So, and example, use case might be if you want to drive the structure of your website from STEP, then you can have you can define that as a yellow classification, and you can link your product in multiple places. Entities are most frequently used in CMDM, customer data implementations. And they're used to create hierarchies and that do not require inheritance of data. And publications are used to create hierarchies and elements, and they are used in the print and publishing solutions. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a couple of screenshots here, and on the left-hand side is an example of how a product object looks like. Notice, all the folders are blue in color, and we have the different folders. And at the bottommost level, we have kind of a SKU or the product that is going to be sold. On the right-hand side, we have the classifications. Notice they are yellow in color. And we have linked some products to some of these folders, and we will get to the specifics of how these works and what it means in the coming slides. Next slide, please. And here we have screenshots of the entities, assets, and publications. Entities are gray in color, and again, like I said, they are mostly used in customer data implementations. And then we have the assets, and we have a small JPEG image here. And the last one is a publication object, which is mostly used again in the print solutions. Next slide, please. So I think one of the the basic questions obviously is if you are looking to implement STEP, like how do I approach designing our data model in STEP? And next slide, please. So the first step is identifying the domain, whether it's customer, product, or supplier, etc. And this might seem a little bit obvious, but the reason this is there is because certain parts of the solutions, like entities, are widely and specifically used in certain domains. And you have some functionality like the customer data functionality only works with entities. So that's why it's kind of important that you understand what domain you're dealing with. Once you have identified the domain, you need to identify all the conceptual objects in the domain. And any object that has information tied to it, any master data tied to it, is a candidate to be part of the data model. And again, remember, that an object can be something that exists in the physical world, like the product that you're selling, or it can be just a logical, concept, a logical way of organizing the objects. So once you have identified these object types, you have to identify and define the attributes for each of these object types. And you have to remember that the primary purpose of your product hierarchy that you're building is proper attribution assignment to your objects. So it is best practice to group your objects according to their similar properties or characteristics, so that we can use concepts like inheritance and category specific attributes that are part of the STEP platform. And for example, if you're talking about a product centric data model, the product hierarchy would be built from all the objects from the product super type, the blue folder structure, and it's configured in the STEP workbench. Next slide, please. So here, we are looking at a product-centric data model, and on the left-hand side, we have the system setup tab in the STEP workbench. This is where you would define the actual object types and attributes and so on. So all the data model configuration would be done in the system setup tab. On the right-hand side, you see the actual tree. So, and the way it maps is, if you look at this node in the tree, this corresponds to this object type that you have defined. And the next level here, the products, corresponds to this object type, and apparel corresponds to the level 1 object type. So each of these are object types that you have to define. So and at the end, or the leaf nodes are where you would be defining the items that you're selling, or the services that you're offering, and so on. So this is how what you do in terms of defining the data model translates into the actual data that you're going to master. Next slide, please. So far, we have just talked about the objects, and we have not really talked about the relationships between them. And I think it's very, very important, because if you have just a list of independent objects without interacting with each other, it's not going to give you all the functionality that you need. It's when you tie the objects together that is when you can enhance or use the full capabilities of STEP. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about the relationships between objects, these are defined in STEP using references and links. And examples of relationships references would be like if you go to the Oriental Trading website, and if you buy a Rubik's Cube, you might see a prompt saying that hey, people who have bought this Rubik Cube, also have bought, these puzzles, or there is a newer or a better version of this product. So, here they're trying to define, the concepts of, upsell or cross-sell, basically relationships between objects. So this version or this product has a upsell relationship with another product, or this product has a cross-sell relationship with another product. So you can establish all these different kinds of relationships between products. And just like we saw that there were 5 different super types, super object types. We also have different kinds of relationships that can be established. And the relationships can be established between almost all the major super object types. For example, you can have a relationship between a product and a classification, a product and a product, a classification and a classification, and so on. Next slide, please. So in STEP, we have 9 different types of relationships. So product reference types are relationships between 2 product object types, and classification reference types are relationship between 2 classification objects, and a product classification link type is a relationship between a product and a classification. So there are 9 different types of relationships, and you define the relationships based on what is the source and what is the target. So that's how you identify what are the 2 objects that form part of this relationships, and you configure the relationship with the source and the target type. Next slide, please. So here we see a couple of screenshots of a product reference and a product classification link. The product reference example is what I gave about upsell and a cross-sell. So you have 2 different products that are related to each other, they're associated to each other. So you can define these kind of relationships. On the right-hand side, we see an example of a product classification link. So here is where products are linked to into a classification structure. And the uniqueness about this particular relationship is that it manifests or shows up in STEP, at least in the Workbench, as a parent-child relationship. Next slide, please. So here we have an example, of an asset object type or asset relationship. And this is used, for example, if you want to store different kinds of multimedia in your STEP instance, if you want to see what is the primary image that is associated to a product, what are the alternate images, what are the instruction sheets, that need to, go with the product. So anything that contains, any digital media content, all those objects, all those asset objects can be linked to products. So next up, Robert is going to talk about taxonomy and alternate hierarchies.
Great, thank you, Jayesh. So yeah, we're going to talk a bit about taxonomies and alternate hierarchies in STEP and what that means to everybody that will be working in those systems. So the words get used interchangeably quite a bit. So I'll go over a bit about what you might hear prominently when you're talking STEP terms. So, when we're talking about a taxonomy in STEP, we're typically speaking about, the primary product hierarchy, or oftentimes you'll hear a consultant or somebody say PPH, right? So, and that's often defined by, the color folders in the STEP system. So we know that our product folders are typically blue. So, we can reference that when you're looking at the STEP workbench from a user point of view. So, your taxonomy is going to be your main hierarchy structure, right, for your system of where your data will live. So when building that out, you know, that just keep in mind that that's where your product will live for that single instance, right? And we want to focus on, you know, properly building out your taxonomy, which will help eliminate, you know, data duplication and inconsistencies that you might find or see throughout your business model, right? So oftentimes, you know, we need to focus on what we're building for. We're solving. So oftentimes we want to solve for more than what you guys are currently doing, right? So we need to focus on the products at hand and how we can define those. And with STEP, we'll do that with our attribution. So you know, the products in your PPH will be defined by attribution, and in that that taxonomy, STEP has inheritance properties that will be leveraged with those attributes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. But an alternate way of looking at your data in STEP would also be done through what Jayesh mentioned earlier, would be our alternate classification hierarchies. And again, when we're talking about Workbench, it's usually comes down to what the user may view. So, you know, the icons are typically yellow folders. So you might hear us talk about yellow folders quite often. And that's just going to be different structures and different views of how to classify your data from your primary hierarchy or taxonomy. And these are different types of scenarios, whether it be, you know, you're feeding to, say, an e-com, maybe some supplier structures. You can also have your assets stored differently. And you would do that through building out different alternate classification hierarchies. And then, as Jayesh mentioned earlier, we would use those references in the system that we established to create those links between either your products to your assets, or, you know, even products to a supplier or a supplier group, and similar scenarios around that topic. So you can think of it this way, you know, your product's main home will be your primary product hierarchy or your taxonomy, right? And they'll be linked to your alternates. So it just, again, and it's allowing you for a different take or a different view depending on the data steward group, or maybe you want to send out your data in a different format or different layout to downstream systems. But ultimately, if you update, you know, just keep in mind that the attribution that lives on that product is going to be the same whether it's in two classification hierarchies or one. So keep in mind that, you know, if you update an attribute value, say on your product that might be living in your alternate classification for, we'll say, Amazon e-com hierarchy, that same value that you edit or update there is the same value that's living on the product in the blue folder. So you're not having to duplicate the work. You're not having to update data in multiple places. It's the same data, just a different way of looking at it. Go ahead and jump to the next slide, please. So one of the questions that we often hear and we come across in our space that was submitted, right, was, you know, the documentation, and as well as what you see in the STEP system, is a product can only live in one spot in your primary taxonomy. So oftentimes they say, well, I want to see it in a different view, or how do I get it into other structures? And like I had mentioned before, we'll do that with our ultimate classifications, and we'll do that linking through references. So we can build out an endless number of alternate classification structures, and then utilizing our reference types that will be designed in your system, you know, selecting that target and that source object, we can then correspond those objects throughout the other systems. And if you jump to the next slide here, I have a screenshot of what this might look like in a potential system. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see our tree view. And again, you know, I mentioned earlier yellow versus blue. So you can see that the yellow folder structure above, that's going to be our alternate classification structures. In this example, we're just looking under that website US, but keep in mind there could be website East, website South. The number is limitless, right? And then we have our blue folder below, which is our primary product hierarchy, and that's where our business model, our base products will live at. That's what our business sees the product as, and then we can classify it however we need to for downstream systems. When you stand on one of those objects in your system, you can notice it to the right-hand side here. I have focused on the reference tab. So when we create those reference types in the systems and configure them, and we're selecting our source versus our target, to an end user, this is what you could possibly see if your user was your data steward was working in the Workbench, right? And from here, we can add, we can take away our references to link those products in and out to each other. To the other classifications, or even link a product to an asset if that was the use case that we're trying to define here. Just to reiterate that, not all of our users are going to be working in the Workbench. So, we could also define this in a web UI screen as well, so that your data stewards can populate those references between the different classifications that you may have in your system. Go ahead, next slide, please. So next up, we're going to talk some more about the attribution and inherited values in STEP. Again, when we're building out our primary taxonomy, we need to keep focused that it's the taxonomy is a primary way for us to organize the objects from your business into a hierarchical structure, and we base that on the attribution of those objects, and we leverage STEP's ability to allow for that inheritance to be used. And we always take note that a good taxonomy eliminates data duplication for your business, right? And it's supposed to help streamline your processes and make sure that your attribute values are clean and proper. So we have three main items to cover for attributes. We'll have our attribute groups, and when we're designing our systems out, we leverage our groupings to keep like-minded values together. Especially when we're talking about from a data steward point of view, maybe looking at a product in either the web UI or even the Workbench, we can collapse and expand those groupings to better our view of the product and maybe the information that we're trying to view and enrich and or update. And then from there, when we're building out and designing our attribution, there's two main attribute types, or two attribute types that we'll be dealing with, and that's descriptive versus specifications. So, your descriptive attribute, is the main item or main values that are describing the object, where specification could be, color of t-shirt, length, width, things like that you might have depending on the type of product that you're selling. And then, as well as, we'll look at the inheritance of those attributes. So one of the primary keys that STEP allows us to do in our blue folder structure, our taxonomy, right, is it allows us to leverage inherited attribution. And that goes, from the parent down to the child objects down under that parent. So, it's, think of it this way: you might have, we'll say t-shirt, right? And we might have an attribute, a value of cotton. So t-shirt material. So you might have that at your top level, and you're going to have multiple t-shirts below it that could have colors, sizes, and ranges like that. So the use case could be that you would assign that cotton material at the top level, and then it would automatically populate to all the children below it. And that's not to say that we can't override that, but that might help streamline your process when you're mass creating products under that parent node, right? So, and the way that we might override an inherited value is by going to that bottom layer, to that child, and editing that value there. So when you're in the workbench and you're looking at your attribution, it's going to alert us that it is whether it's an inherited value or not. So next to the validation, when you're looking at that attribute value in the workbench, there's typically a small green arrow dictating that it is whether it's inherited or not, as well as you'll notice that the value field won't be yellow, or I should say will be yellow, and you won't be able to edit it from a data standpoint. So the user won't be able to go there and edit that. An important note to keep in mind when you're setting that up, and as well as when you're maintaining that data, value inheritance is a super powerful tool. So when you're maintaining that information, it's important to note to take caution, and how high in the hierarchy that you may edit that value. Oftentimes we've seen a user edit the value, at that top parent node, and it negatively impacts all your data below it, right? So just because of that inheritance aspect. So always take caution where you're editing your attribution, and especially higher up, like I mentioned, in the taxonomy of your system. Next slide. So another question that we had submitted, right, was, how should we approach designing our taxonomies for our catalogs, and we can kind of cover this broadly and not focus too much on one particular business, whether it be CPG or a customer implementation or even automotive. We can kind of cover this broadly. So if you want to jump to the next slide. So again, just to kind of cover that question here, oftentimes we want to look at designing it, bottom up or top down. Ultimately, you can go either direction, but from what we've seen in the industry and how best to do this, best practice for us is always to do the design from the bottom up. And that's typically oftentimes your SKU or your product, and then kind of build your system up from that in the hierarchy standpoint, and grouping like items together. You're going to be leveraging, back to our attribution, right? Because we know that our attribution is going to allow us and help us to better define what the differences between our objects and our business model are. And that'll help us to avoid duplication of data, and making sure that data is only updated where it needs to be properly in the system. So we don't. Oftentimes we want to try to avoid the users maintaining data for your attributes on your items that are not relevant for that category. So we need to keep a focus on that. A good example that we've used before is screen size and an attribute. That may be relevant to categories of products, like TVs, mobile phones, or even our watches, right? But not necessarily for clothing, t-shirts, pants, things like that. So it's good to keep focused on how you want to classify and group your objects together, and then as well as focus on the attribution to differentiate. Keep those differences in mind, so that you can come up with a better way of viewing those and putting those items together or keeping them separate. So two of the most important concepts in STEP that we like to focus on, when creating our taxonomies are, again, the inheritance and then our category specific attribution. The inheritance is valuable. Objects at lower levels are, able to get data defined at a higher level. So we just want to keep that in mind when we're building these out. And STEP's super flexible, right? So our taxonomy is our foundation for the system. It's super important. We want to make sure that we have a great foundation to build from, but STEP still allows us the flexibility to make changes as things come up that you may come across or define in your requirement sessions during your implementation, or maybe just a new project to bring some more products or data into the system. I think from there, we have another question that we're going to cover. Chris, I think this was going to be your question, so I'll go ahead and pass the torch to you.
Yeah, so the question was a pretty long one. So best practices, recommendations on sorting, grouping taxonomy attributes, governance thereof, and if it's treated differently than others, and then managing that governance on those attributes when it's used across systems. So I'm going to address this 3 different ways. So the first one, we'll just slice off that bit of the question where we talk about sorting and grouping taxonomy attributes. So this actually really overlaps strongly with what Robert had just answered, but I'll take it a little further. So obviously, if we're just talking from a user's perspective, whether they're working on a given UI screen or a tab on that screen, or if they're working in grid view or working in a smart sheet, the easiest way to group them in that perspective is whatever makes them happy and efficient, because at the end of the day, a happy and an efficient user is going to pay dividends. So if you can achieve that with your implementation, then you're already going to be getting a lot of value out of the system. But that's the easy way to answer. I think what the question is actually asking about is what Robert was talking about, of where should we put the attributes and how do we know we have the right structure to tie them to. So about 80% of the time we're going into an organization, they either don't have a taxonomy at all, or they have a taxonomy that everybody in the room will say, yeah, we hate it. And so in those situations, part of the implementation is not just, okay, bring your data into STEP, but define what you want your data to be. And when we get to define that data as a taxonomy in STEP, and we get to tie the attributes to it, we do take the bottom-up approach that Robert was talking about. And a way to kind of think of the end state there is it's really the greatest common factor of definition. So while you want to tie your attributes as low as possible in the tree, or as low in the tree so there's no extraneous attributes, you want to be able to move them up that taxonomy definition as high as you can, where it still makes sense to all children objects. So, screen size and resolution might affect all display devices or all portable electronics these days. But we want to make sure that we've elevated up to display devices or portable electronics so that we have some consistency when new products are added to the category. If you manage it all the way down at the lowest level, then as new things happen, new legislation is passed, certain categories now have certain restrictions or qualifications, you want it to be applicable to all products there. Or if you add a new product, so new wearable watches, let's add that to portable electronics, and all of a sudden we can inherit a lot of attributes. So we normally take that approach where if we get to define it, we want to push things as high as we can where it makes sense for everything below it and there's no extraneous attributes. But 20% of the time we don't get to do that. And so that 20% of the time is where the taxonomy is actually managed by some other system where we're using it as is. Maybe it's an industry standard, maybe it's a legacy system, something like that. And then that 20%, we just have to adhere to the definition. And a lot of the times governance might not be in place in these organizations, so that taxonomy might just change. And whatever the change happens, we just have to blindly accept it and roll with the punches. And that kind of makes it hard for us to then structure governance around that taxonomy, because all of a sudden the system's going to ingest changes that have downstream impacts. So those are kind of the situations where we'll have a really candid conversation about, should we manage these definitions at the lowest level, knowing that 2 different categories might have very similar definitions with no overlap. And the reason being, if the structure above them changes, we don't want the definition of those products in those taxonomy notes to change. So that's that kind of last fifth of data where we're really going to try to thread the needle between the upstream requirements and downstream requirements, so we can get the most value out of STEP acting as the governance agent. So that's kind of the first part of the question. The second part is governance treated differently than others. So, I mean, the answer here is no, but that's with the qualification of there's a whole nother facet of governance that we're introducing. So when we start talking about the taxonomy attributes and where we're applying them or grouping them in the taxonomy, all of a sudden governance doesn't just apply to, we've been talking about, in governance, we'll talk about systems and user roles and the domains of data and even the types of data, like this is a product versus this is a service. Well, all of a sudden, when we start getting to taxonomy definitions, the way we govern that is the definition of itself starts to become important. So apparel might have a set of taxonomy definitions. So when we have the definition for apparel, it now becomes a topic of governance that we need to agree on, because there might be upstream or downstream requirements that need that to be a stable and continuous definition. So, products, you might say these products have these attributes, these validations, these consumers and providers, these gates. Now all of a sudden we're saying widget A or electronics or apparel or even down to men's undergarments and wearables. Like we can start having wearable electronics. We can start having very finite definitions that are going to help you do better in certain markets and segments. The important part there, though, with this governance challenge isn't necessarily that you figure out how to manage it or enforce it really well. We like to push our customers first just to define it. Like if you can come up with a really good definition of these different areas and you can start putting enforcement into place on those, then you have a lot of ability to then carry that forward, get buy-in, and start doing the enforcement of the things that you came up with. So define what your things are in the taxonomy and get buy-in, not just from your data managers or stewards in the PIM, and that'll be a big step forward. And then the last part is when other systems, hold these attributes, how do we do that? So we run across this a lot. All impacted systems need to be represented in governance as stakeholders. So even if you're focused on, well, we're doing all our data governance and STEP, and this is our product master, and we define the rules. If we're feeding that system downstream to the web, and the web is going to put it in front of a customer, they have expectations. Your users, your consumers are going to have expectations of discoverability and consistency. So those needs, even though you might be two systems removed and abstracted, you need them to bring them upstream so that you can have a common definition that applies to your entire organization. So our ideal practice is that we're going to bring as many of those restrictions that we know about upstream. And as many of as is feasible, I should say. Some restrictions aren't going to be able to be brought upstream. They might exist upstream of STEP. So they might be something that's more restrictive in the ERP that STEP will then consume and allow to be broadened out for other uses. So we want to elevate in the life cycle as much as we can upstream. We want to have one system as much as we can within the restrictions in place. We want to have one system that governs that attribute, that when we have a definition, we want a gate. And when that data makes it past that system, that gate, then we know it is valid. And it could be just is populated or character length, or there could be some approval step that's happening in a workflow that says, okay, I've reviewed this and now I'm willing to publish this. This is romance copy, and now everybody will use this romance copy. But to have that definition of where that data originated kind of gives us a traceability where, one, nobody downstream needs to worry about how to apply governance there because we've done it. So your CMS and DAM users don't have to worry about the data if the product managers have already adhered to their needs. And then when changes need to be made, you're not scrambling to make it down in the CMS. You're going back to your product master and saying, okay, we need to fix this. So in those cases, I would like our CMS and DAM users to be present and part of us building a process in PIM. But that's not always a clear-cut answer because sometimes they have data downstream that just doesn't exist in PIM. CMS can do really cool CMS things. DAM can do really cool DAM things. So they might have data that doesn't fit. And if they do have data that doesn't fit, are we then asking them to maintain data across two different systems? And that becomes frustrating for the user, which is something we never want to do. So that's more of a delicate subject. But then we start talking about, okay, well, what does the lifecycle actually look like? Who are the users involved? Where is the data coming from? Are you doing the data because you want to do the data there, or because nobody else can? Like, what's the reason? So it's kind of many layered when we start talking about multi-system ownership, but the fundamentals are move it upstream, have a common definition, and have a single system enforcing it. So I hope that kind of answered that question. So I really like this question because I think it's very thoughtful, not just from a, what does a checkbox do in the system or a specific problem. It's kind of, as I'm approaching and moving forward, how do I know we're moving in the right direction? So really appreciate this one. One of the questions is in chat I saw being discussed was talking about the use of attribute groups. The most simple use of an attribute group is obviously, like Robert said, we're just going to combine things so that we can show them. Similarly, put them next to each other. They can be present on a UI and such. But you can use attribute groups for much more. We frequently do have attributes used across multiple attribute groups. The really powerful thing you can start doing with that is your permission sets can be tied to attribute groups. Integration definitions can be based on attribute groups. Validation, so your complex governance rules, instead of applying them specifically to attributes, you can apply them to attribute groups. Your UI screens, we build those off of attribute groups. And when we start building the system to adhere to attribute groups, then as you're moving forward and evolving, now you can start linking attributes into attribute groups and implicitly getting all that functionality that you've already built. So you add a new attribute, you add it to a consumer-facing attribute group for maybe web display. Now all of a sudden marketing owns the data and has read-write access. It's on their step of the workflow. It's in their UI screen. It's present on the integration downstream to the website. So we absolutely can reuse attribute groups in a bunch of different ways and have attribute groups that users don't even really know exist because we're just using them to drive that back-end process. So great question. A lot of power that can be eked out there. And then I think there was another question that Jayesh was going to answer.
Yeah, I think there's a two-part question. Can multiple domains be modeled in the same instance, environment / system? And can the domains be interrelated to each other? So Stevo markets Step as a multi-domain MDM platform, right? And it's not just marketing spiel, you know, it is absolutely the case. And I have personally been involved in an implementation where we did product master and the location master and customer master all within, you know, the same instance. So absolutely, multiple domains can be modeled within the same instance, you know, but the platform, you know, obviously definitely supports that. Whether you want to model that in the same instance versus, you know, the same platform, right? So you can have two different instances of Step, or, you know, as many instances as you want. And, you know, you could, in theory, model like product and location in one instance and maybe the customer data in another instance. Or, you know, if you could, if you want, you can model all of them in the same instance. And I would say the determining factor within all of that would be, you know, how much data are we talking about in terms of customer data. It could, you know, extend into, you know, tens of millions of records. So, and, you know, with respect to the SLAs of, you know, the integrations, you know, how fast the downstream systems expect the changes that are made in Step to be, you know, communicated to them. So there are a lot of different factors to be considered, whether, you know, you go with a single instance implementation or multi-instance implementation, but it is technically, you know, absolutely possible to do that. And the second part of the question is, you know, can those different domains interact with each other? And they absolutely can, because Step is extremely flexible in the way, you know, it allows the different domains to interact with each other. For example, in the implementation I was talking about, we had a primary classification of a product into the product master, a blue structure for products, and we had a blue structure for the locations, and we had, you know, interdependencies between, you know, these two domains, you know, in terms of, you know, where can, you know, this product be sold? Is there any requirement or is there any restriction in terms of, you know, where such and such product can be sold, you know, because of either EPA regulations or, you know, other reasons where, you know, you want to control like where a certain product can or cannot be sold. So within that context, we had dependencies between the product and the location master information, and the same can be applicable, to other domains as well. So yes, it can absolutely be done.
Awesome. All right. So what's next? So maybe you've been live for a year, 5 years, 10 years. Maybe you're looking at a new domain. So we always, or maybe you're looking for your first PIM implementation. So I always get the question, all right, where do we start? So the beauty of a mature MDM platform like this is that you don't have to get it right, and you don't even have to get it complete on your first run. And I mean what I say. So a lot of the times, our most successful customers are the ones that they're going to get the value quickly. They're finding the critical problem in the organization. They're focusing a solution in on solving that critical problem. And then they're using that to then pivot the tool forward to get solved more problems, get more users involved, more parts of the business. So you don't have to solve all of your problems on day one. You know, data governance, you're not going to get it complete and correct immediately. Your data strategy, you can't just apply once you come up with it and just check a box and get everybody bought in and have it implemented. And STEP really supports that. So if you want to know what's next, it's really about analyzing your organization and identify where you can either gain a lot of efficiencies. So do things cheaper, faster, better, whatever the case is for you. I'm sure there's something that either you've seen or your users are frustrated with that you can do better. Or you look at a place where you can make a grab for more revenue in the market. So is there a set of customers that are being underserved? Are your customers? Is there more capacity for you to do business there? Is there a new segment that you can move to? Like, what is your strategy outside of data? And then when you figure out that strategy, either for efficiency or driving more revenue from a business perspective, then it's okay. The tool can support it. I mean, hopefully you're walking away with this with the confidence that no matter what you want to do with data, the tool will support that story. So if we can identify the problem, we can build a case for that problem, and then the tool can solve it. And there's some really cool things that we've done across domains and that can solve some very specific problems for customers. So if you have any really exciting ideas, we'd love to grab a whiteboard marker and explore those with you. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Tracy. Who I think is on mute, and I think she thinks she's talking.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. That concludes today's webinar. But as a thank you for attending this Ask the Expert session, we are offering a complimentary one-on-one follow-up session with an expert to answer any specific questions you have, aside from those that we have already covered. This expert session allows for you to have it allows for you to have a special attention of an industry professional to help you through your most difficult pain points. If you're interested in taking advantage in this one-on-one session, please respond to your follow-up email or email us directly at experts@goamplify.com, and we'll be happy to get you started. We hope that this webinar gave you the opportunity to see what our company has to offer. Let's continue the conversation on how Amplify can help your business with our MDM strategy and consulting services. You will receive their recording by email in the following days, and be sure to keep an eye out for more Ask the Expert sessions. We'll be looking forward to being your trusted resource in the MDM space. Have a great day.
Yep, thanks everyone.